Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here, and I'm back with my Gameweek 14 cheat sheet preview. Now, of course, Gameweek 13 has come and gone. A lot of kind of expected results, with the exception to really the Burnley versus Tottenham kind of suspension. But nothing really has changed in terms of how we visualize the league and formations and how strong some specific players are, in my opinion. I think we finally hit a phase where maybe we've changed our minds on certain enablers, especially within the forward positions. But I think now has also, with the Chilwell injury, called for a little bit of reorganization, maybe within the defense. I still think a four back formation is very, very strong at this point in time. And if you've gone for Alonso already, it makes a lot of sense. I just think that around that kind of price range where you have Livermento as your fifth option, and those kind of pieces, that might potentially change in the near future. And that's why we see a much more change towards the top end of the defense. So if I start with the defense, Ben Johnson for me has been given a rise. The reason being, he's actually been nailed on in the last few weeks. You can see that Soufal has been mostly playing the European games and also actually just sitting on the bench. And actually, when when Soufal actually came on in City, it was actually to replace Cresswell. So that's quite an interesting thing that Ben Johnson has actually locked down this position for quite a defensively interesting team. I don't think the West Ham assets are interesting because they get clean sheets, but rather because they provide goal contributions. And Ben Johnson hasn't done much other than his kind of fantastic wonder goal. So maybe he still isn't that interesting as an option. But as someone who holds as little value as possible and plays consistent minutes for quite a decent side, I think Ben Johnson's a great option. Just to kind of fill the value in your team and remove, for example, some of the prices that you've gotten from enablers. So if you're, let's say, moving from Livermento to Ben Johnson, you'd probably net something like 0.3 back that you can redistribute into your team, and that's exactly why he's interesting. And that's also why, for example, Duffy conversely falls this week. He's someone who probably should be shifted out of teams. A very simple side grade away from Duffy is to Lamptey. You can see Lamptey playing this right wing back position consistently now. He does get rested quite often, and I think that's partially due to the fact that he is still coming off of a very, very long layoff, and he's a very young player, so you need to ease him in. And Brighton will be wary of that. The one kind of issue with Lamptey really is going to be what happens over this December period. Does he get rested or not? And how does that kind of affect his overall point hauls? Ironically, what we've seen in the last few weeks is that he's really greatly benefited from being subbed off early. He managed to actually keep the clean sheet as an FPL asset versus Aston Villa. Meanwhile, Brighton actually ended up losing that game 2-0. So potentially that's actually something that will actually really help Lamptey owners. But we do know that at times those types of assets could burn you when they, for example, play coming off the bench, for a 1 point or 2 point haul. But Duffy has to fall. In terms of the 4.5 plus players, Livermento also faces a fall. I think the Southampton games are getting quite tough. We've also seen that defensively they're not anything special really. That was something that we kind of reviewed when we were looking at these kind of overall aggregate team season stats, and Livermento and Southampton particularly do not rank particularly highly in reducing their expected goals allowed, which is also why I didn't really favor McCarthy much as a keeper. Livermento, even though he does play in very offensive positions, clearly just doesn't have enough options to create in specific games when they're kind of locked up. The Southampton team is noticeably very unclinical as well. And for me, Livermento has to fall because I can see that his probably value as a defender might have arguably come and gone. I can still see him holding a decent bench spot and maybe actually getting some surprise clean sheets in the future, just like he did earlier on in the season. But I think it'd be quite wise to actually move away from Livermento. Whether you're stretching that kind of money to upgrade a defender, as we've discussed in several episodes previous, or whether you want to just downgrade to someone like Ben Johnson so you can actually move the value in your team to the midfield or to the forwards. I think those are all foreseeable options, and for that reason, Livermento falls. Tomiyasu actually still stays within that territory just because I think this Arsenal defense have been extremely exemplary, and he's not too far away from Ben White and can probably still actually contribute from a kind of goals and assists point of view, probably less so in terms of goals. We did see him actually get an assist this week versus Newcastle, which was very, very welcomed. So the question I suppose is whether or not you want to actually stretch a little bit of cash so that you get Tomiyasu over Ben White, or whether you actually want to go just that step further to get Gabriel, who probably is a more consistent goal threat. I don't really see Tomiyasu providing anything more than a few assists this season, just from the way that Arsenal are playing. Whereas Gabriel actually, I would say, is a very physically dominant centre back, and I do expect maybe one or two or three more goals from just pure aerial threat. Lamptey is someone who rises. We spoke about him when we were talking about Duffy. I think he makes a lot of sense as a rise in a very quick transition from Livermento, arguably, as well, around that price point. If you want to keep that sort of player in your team as a bench option during this kind of December period, looks very interesting. Mark Guehi also joins the team. He is, of course, a standout player from England's, under 23 sides, and he scored basically in back-to-back weeks. Another kind of massive aerial threat in the league. Someone who probably greatly benefited playing alongside his counterpart in Anderson. So Crystal Palace have recently lost their clean sheets, but he's done extremely well in terms of hauls. I just think in terms of bonus points that he's going to be similar to Dunk last season, where if you don't, let's say, own Guaita on your team, he could be an interesting 4.5 option on the bench. And I don't see why he won't be interesting, especially since Crystal Palace's fixture run is rather good. Brentford defenders conversely fall. They actually managed a clean sheet this week, but I think what I have to say is that simply they're just playing versus Everton. And what we know from Everton is that they're providing absolutely nothing from a defensive point of view. They're so strapped based on all the injuries that they have and, in a sense, the negative football that they are playing. So for me, I don't think that rates Brentford defense or even their goalkeeper extremely high. I just think that was a favourable fixture. We can probably see much of the same with Leeds, in my opinion. I think Leeds are maybe set for or destined for relegation, and we probably expect Crystal Palace to get a clean sheet or for the scoreline to be rather low. I think Leeds and Everton, unfortunately, are probably two most glaringly uncreative sides in the league right now, and I still think that in terms of Brentford defense, they're not worth the 4.5 to 4.7 price that they are currently at. Probably makes sense to actually move those assets into players like Lamptey or Guehi at this point in time. With Gabriel, I have to give him a rise. I think, as I said, he's been instrumental to Arsenal's ability to keep clean sheets in recent weeks, and him being a physical threat makes him much more favourable to someone like Ben White. I think the one counter argument is maybe Tomiyasu, who is a little bit a mix of both, right? Someone who's much cheaper but can actually provide maybe something in terms of return through goals and assists. So maybe the decision making is between Tomiyasu and Gabriel if you don't already own Ramsdale. The thing is, of course, I'm sure a lot of players own Ramsdale. His effective ownership is incredibly high, something around like 45 to 50%, even in the top ranks. But for those players who haven't found the opportunity to get Ramsdale and probably find it easier to move away from a specific defender, I would say Gabriel still is a very interesting defender, especially since, as I will talk about Alonso, I don't think Alonso's as interesting as Chilwell was in the past. Now, if we actually move into the 5.3 to the 5.9 territory, no real movements between James, Alonso, and Rudiger. I have actually just classed Alonso a little bit lower than James. I think Alonso probably might actually feature in the game versus Watford, and potentially there could be an opportunity to rest James and play Azpilicueta during this run. What I will say, though, is I think James is clearly the much better offensive threat. He's much more disciplined and much more incisive at this point in time. I think having a run of games and actually being in kind of fixture form is evidence of that, whereas Alonso seemed to be a foot slower than his one-on-one counterpart today with Wan-Bissaka, and that's kind of my worry with Alonso over this period. How will he kind of manage this fixture congestion at his age, and what will Tuchel do around it? Walker is someone who has also been recently added to the list. Yes, Man City just lost another clean sheet in the dying game with another beautiful Lanzini strike, something that we seemingly see around every year. But I would still say that Man City are a fantastic side. You'd probably like to keep a double defense on if that's the structure that you've gone for. I know a lot of people have been quite dismayed over Diaz and what he's produced over this run, especially if those had gone with Diaz and get kind of game week 8 wild card. But I still think it'll pan out. If you're looking at, let's say, a cheaper Man City defender, potentially Walker's the most reasonable solution, since it seems like Zinchenko isn't someone that Pep really relies on this season, and we know that they're very thin in these kind of areas. In terms of the 6+ players, I would say that Van Dijk has to rise. For me, he's very similar once again, where if you're constantly starting a player and he's an aerial threat, I think they do have a kind of ways into the discussion, right, in terms of defenses, because Van Dijk, we know, has a fantastic fixture run ahead. Yes, a lot of people own Trent. I'm sure some people have deliberately not gone Trent because they find him somewhat overpriced, but I don't think that's the case. I think his stats have proven that, especially lately. But if you own Van Dijk, I think he's a decent kind of hedge towards Trent, and there are going to be game weeks like this where he outperforms Trent. And I think, as I said in previous videos in the past, it was only a matter of time before he got kind of aerial goals in, and it's nice to actually see that as a basis for him to kind of catapult a nice maybe 2 or 3 goal season tally. So we'll see what happens there. Van Dijk's also capable of assists. We know he has fantastic long balls. Not really sure that's going to be a consistent option, but that could definitely be the case. Robertson is someone who also rises, but I just think that he's almost once again a mix between Trent and Van Dijk. I think he's much less creative than Trent, at least this season. From an attacking point of view, you're probably not going to get as much by going Robertson. I feel like if you want to pretty much downsize from Trent, it probably has to be Van Dijk from a defensive point of view. And that's why Robertson sits in that kind of murky territory where he's a differential. Azpilicueta falls just simply because he just hasn't got enough games lately, and James has just been too good, really, and has pretty much kept him on the bench for those reasons. Hey guys, just before we continue with the video, I'd love to shout out OneFootball. They're a fantastic football app that you can actually use to stay in track with all your football news, all your football preferences, all in one place. The beauty of the app is that you can basically subscribe to notifications for any specific team you'd like to follow, any specific league you'd like to follow, or you can actually keep it simple, keep it very private, and make sure that you turn on the app whenever you want, and keep it quiet like that. For me, I actually like to use the app when I'm basically outside of the house or just trying to check up on games, maybe to see what kind of lineups are posted, what kind of press conferences I might have missed, any kind of recaps for games, any previews for games as well, with kind of written commentary on that sort of thing, and also kind of journalistic takes on football as well, all surmised into one place. Personally, for me, I also like to follow the European leagues, try to see what's going on with the midweek games on the kind of app, and also staying track of the international events, like for example the World Cup qualifiers that just passed in the last international break. Hope you guys check out the app in the link in the description below. If we start moving towards the midfield, we'll see that actually the only real change within budget midfielders is just me adding Bissouma, and this is because Norman has been injured. And if you actually see in the last few games, Bissouma has played consistent 90 minutes. He's 4.4 price, so actually probably going to give you some kind of budget savings in a team. If you're somehow, some way, a player who still has a wild card, 4.4 for a player who plays consistently compared to someone like 4.4 who sits on my bench, someone like Mendy, that's a huge kind of boost, I would say, especially during this Christmas period. I definitely could have used an additional 2 points this week, so definitely someone who's quite interesting in that sense, right? Who is cheaper than someone like Alan or Ramsey. In terms of 6.1 to 6.7 players, simply due to the fact that there's no real changes in the 5.4 to 6.0 territory, I would actually say that Saka rises. There's, of course, an injury concern, and I think he's due to go through some sort of musculature kind of tests to see exactly what the issue is. But Saka is now so close to Smith Rowe in price where I would actually argue that they're probably kind of like a 1A, 1B, right? Where in different parts of the season, I imagine Saka will outscore Smith Rowe, and vice versa. Right now, of course, Saka has just hit a goal, and then he's kind of been hampered by an injury. I've given a rise just to give respect to the fact that he's gotten a haul, and he's quite consistent option. We've seen quite a few assists from him this season, but I think there's not much beyond that, right? He probably returns post maybe the United game if it's a short-term injury. Otherwise, I think an easy pivot to someone like Cornet is available, but part of the reason why Saka rises is just because there just aren't too many interesting options in the midfield once you go past the 6.0 price and just before the 7.0 territory, where you start talking about Liverpool midfielders and City midfielders and things like that. In terms of Bowen, he falls for just simply the reason he missed out in the City game. I think a large part of it is just due to fatigue. He's played in many minutes in the European League, or sorry, the Europa League, and for that reason, I think, especially since the kind of fixture run for the next 3-4 weeks for West Ham is still quite tough, the only reasonable time to really pick Bowen in your team is going to be 16/18. So it depends how long you want to wait to get Bowen. I still think he's an option for the future. He's here to kind of pay respect to the fact that he's a very interesting option, someone who takes right-handed corners for this West Ham team that is incredibly oversized against most opponents, and he has been very interesting from an underlying stat point of view, where he's ranked extremely well, both in terms of expected goals and expected assists for this West Ham side, especially since we've seen a massive drop-off from Benrahma in recent memory, which is why Benrahma is nowhere to be seen on this list. Maddison is someone who's actually been included in this kind of midfield territory list. He is someone for me who's quite interesting because I think Leicester always like to change their tactics in different points of the season, maybe due to injuries, maybe due to lack of form, and Brendan Rodgers wanting to change the ship in a sense. Madison, of course, has done quite well in recent games, and I think for that reason he has to kind of rise into this list. He does remind me in a sense a little bit of Zaha, where he's that type of player who probably will have an explosive sort of run of games and then quiet down whenever you buy him. Of course, now the Leicester games are not too bad. I'd say probably if you're a Vardy owner, you'd probably be happy to keep him as a very, very good hedge towards other premium strikers and Ronaldo. Madison is a weird one where I think he still is a little bit overpriced and probably not consistent enough for us to even consider him as an option, especially since in a few weeks' time the Leicester City fixtures will turn for the worse, and that's probably why Madison is still in a void. Gundogan, or Gundogan, sorry, is at 6.9 to 7.7. Is someone who's very interesting. Gundogan is someone who we know did fantastic last season from a goals point of view. And the interesting stat that I've noticed this week is that he now ranks, post the West Ham game, as the highest expected goals plus expected assists player within the City team, just if you look from a flat point of view and don't divide by, let's say, a per match or a per 90 basis. So that actually calls into question whether or not you should maybe go into Gundogan as opposed to Bernardo Silva. I would say Bernardo Silva has been a little bit more consistent over the course of the season, but we know that the issue with the City midfield is that you can pretty much pick the right City midfielder for the wrong week, and that could happen on a continuous basis. Last season, we saw him go on an absolute tear, and it was a very consistent run. I do wonder whether he can actually repeat that, because I think you have the fixtures right in front of you. They're really, really good Man City fixtures, and potentially, even as a pivot from, let's say, someone like Rafinha, I can clearly see him being a fantastic option. So that's why I've added him to this and immediately put him in this kind of territory where he's not even considered differential for me. I think he could have an immediate impact in your team, and is going to be very great in terms of differential as a selection percentage. Mount has to fall. That once again has to due to the fact that is due to the fact that Chelsea has had a lot of rotation. We've seen Tuchel probably prioritize Ziyech due to his better Champions League performance in the midweek, and Mount has struggled since his kind of illness issue. I'm not exactly sure is going on. There's also kind of contract negotiations, but I won't delve too much into that. But simply put, I think he's holding too much cash in your team to even be considered at this point in time. He has to be moved out, similar to someone in the list below in Havertz. But I'll first talk about Sancho, right? Sancho is someone who has scored on 2 games on the bounce. He scored versus Villarreal and then scored versus Chelsea. He does seem to be leading the line in certain games, and I really wonder whether Rangnick will play him as maybe a false striker in his 4-2-2-2 system. I'm not exactly sure what role Sancho will play. I think he probably will still end up playing as a right mid in the 4-2-2-2 system, where maybe, let's say, Ronaldo plus someone like a false 9, Bruno Fernandes, lead the line. So we'll see exactly what happens there. I think we have to kind of wait for that Arsenal game to get an understanding of what role Sancho will play, because we've just moved on from Solskjaer. Sancho has looked very exciting and I think exhilarating under Carrick, but we will have another manager change basically in a few days' time. And as we know, the team selections have not been determined by Rangnick. So that means that maybe Sancho's position once again will change, and maybe his effectiveness will once again change. So we'll see what happens there. I think he's a differential at this point in time, but someone who can clearly surge up these rankings as the fixtures kind of ease up, for United, and as he gets better performances and finds a kind of stable role and position in this team. Grealish and Havertz fall for similar reasons. They've both been, I think, injured, arguably, and also unfit, and hold too much price for you to even consider keeping them, in my opinion. It's so much easier to side grade into other options, such as Jota, who is such a fantastic option at 7.6, 7.7, whatever price he is, or another Man City midfielder. The Chelsea midfielders clearly just don't hold that much value. Lukaku has also joined the side again, and that will probably affect their returns, as we saw during that kind of period where Lukaku was doing quite well, and the Chelsea midfielders were keeping quite quiet. So that's pretty much all I have to say for the midfielders. If we move on to the forwards, I think this is where we have, once again, a lot of momentum shifting, and that's due just simply to the fixtures, as I was talking about last week, where Wolves are kind of at the dying end of their good attacking fixtures, in my opinion, and what we've seen from Wolves is that they've not been creative enough. Conversely, though, Watford have been very creative, even versus some of the tougher opponents, in the league. I would say, of course, Leicester and United have not been particularly good defenses at this point in time, sorry. But we do know that most teams in the league are going to give up chances to teams that are creative. And actually, this Watford side under Ranieri have been quite creative. If you look at the expected goals in the Leicester game, they actually outscored Leicester from that kind of point of view. And versus easier opponents, Dennis and King will be fantastic options during this run. If we just look at Dennis as an isolated asset, right? He's the third highest scoring forward in the league. Yes, he has AFCON, but you can probably keep him for a very nice run. He's so much cheaper than some of the other assets at this point in time, and everyone's going for King. Dennis will continue to be a great differential. And if you own him, I'm sure you're very happy with the fact that he probably came off the bench for you, especially due to the suspension of the Burnley game. But I still think Dennis, for me, is someone who has to rise above just slightly of King. I know King gets the penalties, but he definitely seems to be the more incisive player, right? The stats actually favor King. His expected goals and expected assists are really off the charts for someone, from a team of Watford's quality. So King has got to be that second option, right, in this kind of enabler territory. But for me, Dennis actually does seem to be the more interesting attacking option. The question is whether you are actually wanting to, let's say, keep Dennis until AFCON and then wanting to switch him into maybe, let's say, King at that period. Because I do think Dennis can offer you a very cheap enabler for the next few weeks. The next two games are going to be tough. It's going to be Chelsea City. You're not even going to consider him there. But why not actually put 5.3 into a player who's super capable as opposed to 4.5 or 4.4 for someone who's going to get you nothing? And that's pretty much how creative Dennis has been. He ranks so favorably amongst some statistics where he's probably within the top 5 to 10 attacking players in the league just from stats. And that tells you more than enough, when he's at this kind of elite price. Fran conversely falls because he's someone who's been incredibly unclinical. Not unclinical, sorry, but not, how do you say it? I think he just hasn't been in the right position at all. He's actually had 0 shots on target in the last few weeks. So he's just not interesting as an option whatsoever. And that comes down to the fact, as I said, that Wolves have not been creating enough chances. They've really picked their chances in very fine occasions and scored out of nowhere. In the game versus Norwich this week, you'll actually notice that Norwich had higher expected goals than Wolves, and that's not a very good sign. Yes, of course, Norwich are benefiting from having a new manager and probably are out overperforming slightly at this period. But I think this Wolves team, especially since we touted them to be quite an attacking team at the start of the season, just haven't really matched up to our expectations of that. And we can see that overall in terms of the team XG stats over this really nice fixture run. And the fact that they haven't been able to deliver as many goals, I think points towards how the stats will regress, especially as the fixtures get tougher for Wolves and Fran clearly has to fall. I think he's an easy side grade into someone like King or Dennis that we've already mentioned, or even Pookie if you want a little bit more of a differential. At the 6.0 territory, I've included Tony for a rise. Yes, he scored a penalty, and yes, he was playing versus Everton, but the fixtures are still very good for Tony, and that's exactly why we bought him a few weeks ago, right? He's still there. His price is probably still going to rise at this point in time. I think he's actually set for a price decrease, but people are probably going to make a U-turn on Tony, given the fact that he's hauled in back-to-back weeks, got the 3 bonus points this week. For me, he's still the talismanic option in a sense versus Brentford. They still play largely around him. Yes, Mbumo kind of gets most of the XG, but I would actually say that Tony is still someone you want to consider for your team. He is someone who probably is a nice downgrade away from someone like Jimenez at this point in time if you're not really consistently or you don't have faith in the consistency of someone like Dennis or King, especially since he has to play City and Chelsea at this point in time. But that's pretty much all I have to say about Tony. I think eventually we might have to move away from him if Brentford get a little bit more boring and the fixtures kind of tighten up for them, but we'll see what happens there. Jimenez, for the same reasons as we've discussed with Hwang, has to fall this week. I think he holds up a lot of price. A lot of the players in this kind of price point are arguably overpriced. I would say it probably makes sense to hold your money into these midfielders and these elite defenders who've been able to get clean sheets. This week, we didn't actually see much in terms of defender returns from an attacking point of view. But we saw a lot of clean sheets all around the league. And that probably speaks towards, once again, the favorability of having these defenders in our teams and probably the lack of favorability for us to hold these assets such as Jimenez, Wilson, Antonio, and Watkins. And, it goes part and parcel where Antonio and Watkins both fall. They both didn't get a hold this week. Arguably, Antonio is still within a tough run of games, and he's going to find his games or see his games being easier soon, but he still has to play Chelsea and then Arsenal in the near future, whereas Watkins has a few games before, once again, Aston Villa have tough opposition. So for me, they both fall. And Bamford and DCL are people who we still kind of think about as an afterthought, but they're not that close, in my opinion, I think, to returning to the field. And it's going to be a very kind of fixture congested period. They probably will have to be eased in terms of games. I doubt they would come back immediately and start playing 90 minutes on a consistent basis. I'm not sure what Bielsa will do to Bamford, but that's kind of just my opinion on things. With Vardy, he's someone who actually rises. As I said, the fixtures are still okay for Vardy for the next period. Maybe you can actually keep him before the switch to Ronaldo, maybe in the Norwich game, right? So that's kind of my opinion on Vardy. He probably just rises just due to the fact that, once again, the other premiums have not been interesting whatsoever. Kane, unfortunately, didn't get to play this week, so we didn't really know what he was going to do versus Burnley. So we'll have to see how things pan out there. But the fixture will probably be rescheduled for the later parts of the season due to Tottenham's kind of fixture congestion. And unfortunately, we're just going to lose out the points there and not see exactly what happened with Kane until much later. With Ronaldo, he has to fall. I just think that, especially with the benching versus Carrick, and then also a lot of talk about, let's say, what Ranić expects from kind of pressing structures and what specific players need to do in his system, calls into question maybe what Ronaldo's efficacy, I think, as an asset at this point in time. He also still is going to play versus Arsenal next, which actually have been recently, I think, United's bogey team. So that is why Ronaldo falls for me. Another concern I have, even though I think Ronaldo actually will be a fantastic option by the time the kind of Tottenham games, Tottenham fixtures dry up and United are versus Norwich, is that there's just no real reason to hold that much money into Ronaldo at this point in time, especially when the fixtures aren't great. We've seen a lot of assets haul at much cheaper prices, and once again with these kind of forwards, I'm really tempted to not put any of them into kind of a best category, because it doesn't seem like it really makes sense to own a captaincy beyond Salah. Arguably, your captaincy could just be mixed around other Liverpool players as opposed to Salah, before you even consider other kind of second premiums as options. Of course, Vardy had a brace this week, which was great, but I really doubt many people were interested in getting Vardy, especially since he had blanked quite consistently over already what was quite a nice run. Let's move to the keepers and just round out the video, though, shall we? With the keepers, I would say the interesting thing is that McCarthy hits a fall. I think if you actually look at his kind of goalkeeping numbers, they've consistently fallen since the period where we were super interested in Livramento and McCarthy as assets. He definitely doesn't pass the eye test for me. I think the Norwich game was a good insight as to how poor he is as an individual keeper, and I think he's just not a great option from that point of view. That's exactly why I said it didn't make sense to move away from Sanchez to McCarthy. Yes, I would actually admit that Guaita has performed very poorly since Sanchez kind of left my team, as an example, or since Sanchez got a red card, rather. But I still think that it's about fixtures, right? Guaita still gets to play versus a very, very poor Leeds side next, so that's going to be a nice little benefit if you're a Guaita owner, whereas McCarthy's fixtures are actually getting much worse than Sanchez and Guaita's, and that's pretty much all I have to say about that. With Salah, for me, he rises. Once again, another double-digit haul in back-to-back weeks from a keeper. That's fantastic. He's someone who always goes for these long balls, so that kind of gets him bonus points. And then also the kind of style that Wolves play from a defensive point of view is that they do allow a lot of shots, but a lot of them are kind of low XG shots from the opponent. That actually pretty much is an easy stacking for Salah of bonus points and save points. And that's why we've seen him do so well in the last few weeks. We've seen someone, for example, like Cody get a lot of bonus points due to the way that Wolves are actually offering teams, I think, a lot of chances, but not necessarily very kind of impactful and high impact chances. So we'll see what happens there. I think Salah's maybe beautiful kind of run might dry up soon because the fixtures are getting much tougher for Wolves, but he still has Burnley next if that game gets to get played, but we'll see what happens. With De Gea, I've actually added him to the list. He's not been interesting whatsoever from a statistical point of view. He ranks very low in terms of saves percentage, and that's just due to the amount of shots that he's actually been faced with. We've actually seen, I would say, from the eye test that he looks quite good this season. Some kind of classic De Gea errors in terms of positioning, but in terms of the kind of the reflexes, the saves, I think that's still all there for De Gea. The fixtures are finally easing up a little bit soon, and I definitely expect that, you know, United could benefit from a new manager bounce where maybe under Ranić they could find a style of play where they suffocate teams and actually finally prevent teams from actually creating very consistent and clear counter-attacking opportunities versus them. Whether that actually will pan out, we'll have to kind of wait and see. I think maybe after the Arsenal game, where we can make a nice deliberation of things, or maybe even a game after that, because we could pretty much wait into that Norwich game before we think about De Gea as an option. But I will keep him reserved there. Also, he's done incredibly well with the penalty saves this season, so credit to him on that. But that's not a consistent way to get points, so we'll see what happens, and he remains a differential at this point in time. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. I hope you guys have a wonderful week ahead, and, a short turnaround for the game week, but it will be nice to have much more football.